Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. We're continuing on our discussion with the Cold War, and in particular, we're looking at a series of proxy wars that would take place between the Soviets and the United States. And so, the we're going to start this one with Cuba. Now, remember when we looked at the map up here that showed the first, second, and third worlds, notice that there are a lot of third world countries here, and as we know, the Soviets began to reach out and offer aid to some of those countries because they were asking for aid on both sides, but the Soviets were very willing to oblige. Also, notice this right here is Cuba, and it is considered part of the Second World because it did ultimately align with the Soviet Union. So, we talked about Cuba in a few units ago and looked at some videos about how it kind of emerged. And well, the United States backed the current, I guess, dictatorship that preceded communist Cuba under Fidel Castro. And the reason why they backed these dictators is because they benefited economically. All right, there was a lot of economic benefit to backing these guys. So even though they were dictators, and you would think that the United States kind of favors freedom and democracy, they also favor mutual economic benefit. But Fidel Castro comes to power, and he also was a brutal dictator who kind of shut down the press and took away the people's freedoms and things like this. But one thing that he did pretty soon after was he nationalized, meaning the government took control of the economy, and in doing so, he also took control of United States sugar refineries. Now, this right here is going to put him at direct odds with the United States economic interest in Cuba, which is going to lead to a U.S. embargo. So what we mean by embargo is pretty much a boycott. We're not going to do any kind of trade with Cuba. And the idea was that we wanted them to suffer without being able to get necessary goods from the United States. But what this did was it caused them to rely on the USSR, and Stalin. I guess the Soviets were very willing to help out in any way they could. And so the Bay of Pigs, what this was this was an effort of the United States who kind of secretly took these rebels more or less from Cuba and trained them up, taught them pretty much how to overthrow the government, and they sent them into Cuba to overthrow Castro. And so the goal here was we didn't want a government that was sympathetic to the Soviets. We also wanted to have our economic interests protected, and so we wanted to overthrow Castro. But the United States didn't supply air support, and without it, and really the rebels expected it, but without it, the exiles were easily defeated by Castro's forces. They didn't stand a chance. Like, it wasn't even close. And so this was a humiliating loss to the United States, and really it kind of solidified this I guess this political disparity between Cuba and the U.S. But the Soviets looked at this and they were thinking, well, if the United States isn't gonna really do anything here, then we're probably a little bit more free to do as we see fit with Cuba. And so they began installing in 42 different locations these missile sites in Cuba. And so what this does is it puts Soviet missiles like ridiculously close proximity to the United States. And President Kennedy looked at this and was like, well, this right here needs to be undone. This is a threat to U.S. security, and we're not going to stand for it. And he issued a blockade to go around Cuba to prevent any further Soviet, coming in and out and to do this kind of work in Cuba. And Khrushchev, who was in charge of the United States, the USSR at the time, actually did agree to remove the missile sites in the event that the United States does not invade Cuba. So we've talked a lot about brinkmanship. This right here truly did kind of make people on edge because this is probably the closest that we came to nuclear war of some kind, because there was a point here where the line was drawn a little bit closer to the United States in the sand, and there was no way we were going to let it get any further than it was, because that would be an imminent and immediate threat that would have possibly resulted in nuclear war. And so the fear was really real and really there, but luckily this kind of dissipated. But it also left Cuba in a position where they were required, more or less, to rely on the Soviets for their own well being. No one else was really willing to do a whole lot of trade with them at this point. The Cubans would be hit hard after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. Iran was another place and really, this is similar and different, but what's happening here is that Iran was actually quite secular. So when we talk about secular, all right, and we looked at this word back in the Renaissance in the very beginning of this course, secular means worldly, okay? In other words, not focused on religion. So when you think about Iran, Iran today is a very, very religious, very, very conservative Islamic state. Okay, and the religion is a theocracy. Okay, so what that means is that religion and politics go hand in hand there. The government is based on the religion of Shia Islam. So with that said, prior to the way it is now, the Shah, who was kind of like the king of Persia or Iran, was he embraced the West. He brought in big oil companies. He invited in foreign investment. They had big skyscrapers and modern cities and all these different things, and were a pretty secular state. But most of the people there were still really poor, conservative, religious peasants, and this massive gap between rich and the poor kind of caused a little bit of nationalistic feelings, and the people that were so poor, they wanted to change. They wanted to change. They wanted kind of a return to the traditions and religion of Iran. And so, in 1953, the Shah was ousted. But then, the United States was kind of afraid that if the Shah wasn't reestablished and this secular country wasn't reestablished, then what would happen is the new government would reach out to the Soviets for support. And we can't have that because, Iron Curtain, containment. So they ended up helping the Shah get back in power due to their fear that that the new government may rely on the Soviets. And so the Ayatollahs are these religious leaders in Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini, all right, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was the leader of those religious individuals, and today the Ayatollah is actually the leader of Iran. So we hear about the prime minister of Iran and things like that, but really the person that calls the shots in Iran is the religious leader known as the Ayatollah. And Ayatollah Khomeini appealed to the poor Iranians that opposed the Shah's Western-influenced rule. And so he would make these tapes, and he was in exile himself, but he would make these tapes and kind of fuel the fire of nationalism in Iran, and ultimately had the Shah ousted. And so I believe it was 1979, he comes back in power, and is incredibly anti-United States, and also is very anti-secularism in the Middle East. And so he even is at odds with the then dictator Saddam Hussein of Iraq, which was the country next door, which also had a large Shia minority. But he was at odds with that guy due to his secular approach to governing Middle Eastern countries. And then finally, the last place we're going to look at that was kind of one of these proxy wars would have been Afghanistan. Okay, so Afghanistan was under control of the USSR. And but you got this Muslim nationalist group. Muslim nationalists opposed the Soviets, and it led to Soviet invasion. So the Soviets actually went into, because they weren't going to let this go. They were going to fight off these Muslim nationalists and keep hold of that territory. And so this was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The Mujahideen, which was the Muslim nationalists, resisted Soviets successfully. And by 1980, Mikhail Gorbachev actually had the Soviet soldiers withdraw from Afghanistan, mainly because at this point we're going well into the 1980s. We're trying to deal with, I guess the Soviets are trying to deal with problems, their internal forces, that eventually are going to get so out of hand it's going to lead to the end of the Cold War, which I believe we're going to discuss in the next video. I'll see you there.